So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is really looking at equity and inclusion in credit for prior learning. I'm Nan Travers. I'm the director for the Center for Leadership and Credentialing Learning at SUNY Empire State University in New York State. We are a statewide university serving primarily adult learners, although we have people from all ages. My background, I have been a writer, researcher, thinker in the field of assessing prior learning for 30 years. And I have worked with many institutions across the United States as well as internationally. I am currently one of the co-leads for Credential As You Go, which is a national initiative looking at different forming of credentials, trying to really rethink the whole credentialing system in the United States. And we're currently being funded through the U.S. Department of Education and also Walmart, and we've had past funding for this around Lumina Foundation. In that work, we also are really looking at prior learning. We have a framework for developing different kinds of incremental credentials that capture learning as we go along. And at the center of that is prior learning, really thinking about how to capture that learning, making sure that people are recognized for what they know and can do, and that becomes formally recognized and enables people to use it towards their credentials for both work and for further learning. So I'm going to go through some different concepts that we've been working with in the whole idea of equity and inclusion around credit for prior learning. And then we'll open up for comments, discussion, questions, that kind of thing. So just to start off, you'll hear me of kind of flipping terms a little bit, which I apologize, but really there are very different ways that people have been talking about this. I am leaning much more towards learning recognition, so that it's not just thinking about learning that's prior, but that we're really looking at recognizing all learning. We're going to mainly talk about it as credit for prior learning, which is really a piece of that, thinking about looking at how to assess prior learning and awarding that credit. So that's specifically within the academic environment and going towards credentials such as degrees. Prior learning assessment is a term. Other countries, this is actually it's a growing field. It's worldwide and has been for quite a few decades. The prior learning assessment and recognition is a Canadian term. Recognition of prior learning is pretty much a European term. And then validation of prior learning is also being used by many different countries as well. So I'm just bringing up that if any of those terms are being used, we're really talking very similarly. And really what we're thinking about here is the whole process by which verifiable learning, and the verifiability is an important feature here, that's acquired outside of the traditional learning environments, is assessed for college level credit. So the credit itself here is part of the definition when we think about credit for prior learning. If we're looking at the overall arching of learning recognition, it may not be specifically for credit, but it would be in terms of being credentialed. So there are a couple of foundational pieces that I would like to begin with. And one is that we're really talking about all learners here, regardless of who they are or where their learning is the source of their learning, and that they should have access to and support for having their learning recognized. What's important here is that and as I get into some of the discussion a little bit further, we really see that some of the two areas where there's inconsistency in practices, and one of it is who's allowed to participate and what learning is allowed to be recognized, validated, and credentialed. And so that regardless of who they are or where their learning originated is a very critical piece here. And that what we're saying is that everybody should have access to and support for this. the I want this is a quote from one of my colleagues at SUNY Empire State University, Frances Boyce. And her point is that PLA, so prior learning assessment, is strength-based, and that students of color are often approached from a deficit perspective. This, I think, is a very profound and important statement, is that when we are looking at recognizing people's learning and credentialing it, whether it's through credit or through other kinds of forms of credentials, that we really are looking at what do you know, what can you do? So it's the strength-based piece. It's not about you're missing this or you're missing that. And so where we see bias within a lot of the advising and approach to students of color is it's often from you don't have, let's say you don't have your math skills, or you don't have this, or you don't have that. And it's a tendency that for really all students, that as we start to bring them into an institution, that we start to think about what they're missing from that deficit perspective, instead of saying, hey, you already have knowledge. Isn't this fantastic? Let us recognize what you have. And now what are the other pieces that you need to fulfill the goals that you have? And so I really like Frances's quote here, that I think it's an important piece to be considering. And when we think about our learners, we have a tendency in education to think about, okay, people go through education, then they stop, they're going through work, they have their family, they're connecting to the community, and almost as though they're segmented. And from a learner's perspective, this is everything that they're involved in. They're not saying, I only go to school for this amount of time. It's I'm always learning. I'm going to work. I have my family and my community. And so when we really think about learning recognition, we have to think about how that crosses all of the aspects of somebody's life, not just the portions that fit into a particular program. Now, in reality, for a lot of our educational programs where we're accepting credit for prior learning, we are really thinking about, okay, they have this program, what learning do they have that will fit into that program? And a lot of institutions have developed really a course match system in terms of it's got to match up exactly. But we tend, when we do that, is it's dismissive of everything else that the people know. And so one of the things to consider is really to be thinking about how we can recognize all the learning that somebody has, and value that learning, and then talk about what pieces fit into the educational perspective, instead of saying, well, you don't fit here, so we're not going to use your prior learning. There's a very different messaging that can happen around that. In other countries, such as Australia or in France, it's actually part of national law that people have the right to be evaluated for the knowledge that they already have. And in both of those countries, as part of that law, it is used in the vocational side. So they talk about the educational side, and they talk about the vocational education and training, the vet side. For example, in Australia, they, as part of their national law, people can go through a recognition of prior learning process to get validation for different kinds of work certifications. And so once again, in the United States, we have really focused about it around education. I am trying to see that we expand that thinking. And so it's very possible that even within your institution, that if you have certain kinds of competencies that people need to make, if we think about the educated person, if we think about different kinds of other activities that we may have, like such as volunteerism with our students, or service learning, that individuals may already have learning in that area, and also could be recognized and formally credentialed, maybe even through badges or micro-credentials, so that we start to think of the whole person, that this is not something that is, we're not just, we talk about what an educated person is and what a higher ed education is about. It's not just about meeting the requirements of a degree. And so we really want to think about, how does learning recognition span across the life cycle of an individual, their learning cycle. And so when I look at some of the data in terms of um, from the equity and inclusion perspective, there are some pieces that I would like to just bring up. So I don't expect on this screen you can read all the little fine print here, but on the left side where it is the green there, what it's showing is the earnings based on degrees. And this is coming out of the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And you can clearly see that the higher the degree, the higher the earnings, and the lowest being around individuals who have some college, no degree, high school diploma, no college, or less than a high school diploma. And then in the opposite one, looking at unemployment rates, so the one on the right with the blue bars, we see just the opposite. So the higher the degree, the lower the unemployment rates, with the highest unemployment rates, again, being with that some college, no degree, high school diploma, no college, less than a high school diploma. The thing that is important here is that, at this point, and this has been said over and over again, that in order to get the kinds of employment that are going to have sustainable wages, that people need degrees. There's still a dividing between those that have a degree and those that don't have a degree. And when we say that, we tend to think about how people who don't have a degree, we basically in this country tend to treat them as though they have no knowledge. And yet so many of these folks have good knowledge and the good skills that they've developed. A lot of them have been working. They've not had the opportunity to either get into higher education or continue their higher education. And so we really have a responsibility, I think, that higher education could be also recognizing learning that may not fit in a degree, but also can be credentialed to help people through. For example, we don't think of the credit for prior learning as being part of a non-credit side because we're focused so much on the credit. So if you get into the learning recognition, it's very possible that people could be recognized on the non-credit side that can go towards workplace certifications that you may be offering through your institution. When we look at numbers that are coming out of the COVID-19 era, we also see that there's huge differentials here in terms of our students of color versus white students. And COVID really hit hard. None of this is new information to any of you, but just simply that we really see that it hit both on the enrollment side and on unemployment side, where we have decreases in students of color returning to school from the COVID period and increases in unemployment. So if we look at the post-secondary attainment data, the National Student House the Clearinghouse has their more recent report puts us at over 40 million adults that have some college, but no credential. I've taken the census data and recalculated. It comes out the same as what they had. But what I have here, so it's about just a little over 50% of our adult population that do not have a college credential, so little under. But I said, okay, what if we just call that 50-50? Let's round it off. And when we think about that, the numbers come out that 1 out of 6 adults in our country have some college and no credential. So 1/6 of our population, what that boils down to is it's either someone in your family, it's someone, the neighbors, it's somebody in the grocery store. But when we think about any gathering of, folks across the neighborhood, when you think of 1 out of 6, and I'm sure every one of you have a story of somebody who started college and whatever the reason was, they were not able to get a degree or a formal credential. This is a systemic issue. This is not an individual issue. What it is that these numbers really point out that we at one level, we ignore an enormous amount of people. So thus the fading out of my symbols here, the darkest blue there really represent those that have a college credential, get recognized, and they get the jobs. The 1 out of 6, that when you have some college, they are recognized a little bit more, but not as much. And then the 2 out of 6 that have either upper secondary or below, we basically are ignoring them in our society and leaving it up to them to figure out how to get work. So the role of credit for prior learning here is that 2 out of 6 that don't have any college experience, and the 1 out of 6 that have some college experience but no credential, again, they have learning. They have things uh, that can be, knowledge and skills that can be assessed and verified and be able to be recognized for those. I also took that data and I asked, like, if I go back here and on the lower right, this is the percentage of, 71%. So let's say 70% of the adult population that have a college credential are white. And then the balance are for people of color. That proportion, when you look at the numbers of people in this country, they tell us a story, but it's sort of buried within that data because too much data reduction. So I did an analysis to say, okay, and these are the groups that are reported in the census data. So that's why other groups are not included in here, is not because I'm ignoring them, but it's based on the data that I had available. This is all public data, and I just downloaded the data sets and worked this out. So my question was, well, what's it look like within a group? So, what's the proportion that got degreed in the white versus the Black versus the Latinx, or versus, in this case, Asian, were the ones that I had the data on. And what I'm really struck with is, first of all, if you look at the under the Black adults, 18% with some college and no degree. That's the highest number. At the same time, for Black adults that have student debt, they have the highest percentage of student debt across the board. So we have the largest number that have some college, but are not with a credential and carrying the highest student loan debt, and with no recognition. So we're increasing the inability for a group of learners to not be recognized, have more difficulty getting the jobs, and have more money to pay back. When we look at the comparison between the white adults and Latinx adults, we also see almost the opposite here. So, 53% degreed on the white, 57% with a high school or less on the Latinx, and so it's almost exactly the opposite. And what becomes really a huge question for me is, why is this happening? I mean, we can, and I'm going to come up with some suggestions that have come out of some of the research. But really, when we start to look at within a group, we're seeing differentials in terms of those that have had the opportunity to go to higher ed institutions and complete. And so we really have to be thinking about different approaches with our different groups, because we're seeing such a differential here. And when we look at the kinds of learn work patterns by the different kinds of credentials, we also see where professional development or additional learning is taking place. So those with less than a high school, so they have no credential, they've gone to school, they go out to work, and they're gaining professional development. And I'm using professional development as my terminology to think about the kinds of learning that's happening in the workplace. High school credential, the same thing. They're going to school, they go to work, but at least they have a high school credential and they're gaining knowledge in the workplace. The same with some college and no degree, or some college and no credential. So you get that same pattern. And then when we look at the typical work school patterns of many of our adults, it's going to school, going to work, going to school, going to work, going to school, going to work, gaining more professional development, and actually with work, gaining professional development at all those places. And so that is our most common pathway that we see of a lot of our learners. The last one there in terms of being a focused degree pathway is the idea that you go to school, go to school, go to school, go to school, and finally go to work, and then you gain all this other workplace knowledge. It's important to be thinking about these patterns because again, when we talk about credit for prior learning, we're talking about looking at the kinds of learning that people have and thinking about how to assess it and then be able to formally recognize it. Our populations that are getting less than a high school credential, and then having that some college no credential, they are gaining workplace knowledge at an earlier rate and sometimes a faster rate than those that fit that degree pathway. And so the intermediate degree pathway, they're gaining some of that workplace knowledge as they're going along. The focused degree pathway, which is the traditional way we think about higher education, is that it's really, you're gaining all this school, but you don't get that workplace learning until later. And so many of our adults who have been working have gained a whole lot of knowledge at a different rate than our individuals who are just going to school for a longer period of time. So this is actually really important because when we're working with our adult learners and, maybe they have a bunch of transcripts, that's sort of that intermittent degree pathway, or maybe they don't have transcripts, but they say, well, I've been working for the last 15 years. That immediately says, wow, they have knowledge and skills that they've been gaining for the past 15 years that maybe our student who's been going straight through hasn't gained. So they may be more apt to have learning that can be assessed. The other thing I wanted to note here, which is my little side box, is just that the National Student Clearinghouse has indicated that only 13% of students who drop out of college return within 5 years. That piece of knowledge tells us, again, that people are gaining knowledge. It's not like if they drop out of college, which all of our language is very us-centric, that anyone who is no longer a student with us, I just said no longer, drop out, step away. All of our language puts us in the center and not the learner in the center. If we said instead only 13% of the students who continue with their lives return to college within 5 years, that's a different piece. So one of the things that I'm really trying to get people to think about is let's look at our language also in terms of what we're saying about our learners there. CPL began in the United States. It has spread worldwide, but it did begin in the United States, and it really does come from a social justice movement. It really was to try to equalize the opportunity for access into higher education for individuals who were working and having other kinds of life experiences where they were gaining that knowledge and skills and finding ways of bringing it in. It has history from the very early 1900s, actually, in our country, but it's often noted to have gained momentum after World War II, when many of the service folks were coming back, and it kind of, the history is a little interesting in that, and I'm just going to bring this up because it shows how we have created differentials here, is that through the GI Bill, folks were able to gain access to higher education, but not at the same rate. So white soldiers, for example, had higher benefits than soldiers of color. They had higher access to education coming back. Women during the war, those that were not in the service, but here in our country, went to work. And what happened was they actually, a lot of companies realized that they could hire the women at lower rates. And so they didn't want to give up the women workers when and I'm going to say the men came back, because that was the greater population. And as a result, there was a bigger push in terms of evaluating military learning for credit, so that the service people coming back would have greater access to higher education to move more into upper level and management, et cetera, levels. And women became still this lower level workforce, less paid, and they were actually considered more dependable. So we created it as a social justice to create more access and entry into higher ed. We also created a differential, and it's a spotty history that we have to come to terms with in terms of thinking about, as we think about the social justice aspect of this, that we're really thinking again about how to create more equal opportunities and not creating a differential. And so the whole narrative that's behind our history and what we're doing is important. And part of that narrative is looking at research. I have a couple different studies that I'm just going to mention quickly. And that is, this was back in 2001, so it's very old, but it's an important piece of study. I was part of the research team. We were looking at academic success of adults from diverse populations. And this was actually a fairly large study. We had universities, community colleges, East Coast, and well, actually it was across the whole country. So it was a very, very large population. And we were looking at the largest predictor of academic success. And what came up was that race was the largest predictor. And I actually was running the stats at the time. And I remember saying, no, I'm not going to put my name against a study that comes up with that again. And in my kind of rebel way, I decided to predict race, and that breaks any kind of prediction. I mean, any kind of stats rules and stuff, because you can't predict an independent variable. Race doesn't change, you can't predict it. But what it did do is that race is really a construct. It's not a univariable. There's many intervening variables. And when we predicted race, what it did is it broke it apart to see what was happening in there. And so what we really found was that the difference had to do with academic, community, and family supports. And it was getting hidden inside this variable called race. And so it becomes really important when we're thinking about data and thinking about the data that we collect within our institutions and start looking at different predictors, that we think about these other aspects that are part of the individual's life, not be thinking about it from just a race perspective. The most well-known research, one thing I didn't mention is that with one of my colleagues at SUNY Empire University, his name is Alan Mandel. Alan and I, for the past, I think we're probably around 12, 13 years, that we had a journal called Prior Learning Assessment Inside Out. It's an international journal on the theory, research, and practice in prior learning assessment. It's online, so it's plaio.org. And we've been looking at research from around the world, and so it's a good place to go to kind of see what's happening. But one of the most well-known studies and is work that CAEL, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, has done. And they did this 10 years ago, and then they repeated it in 2020, really looking at different kinds of student outcomes based on PLA participation and non-participating PLA students. Again, I'm not expecting you to be able to read this whole slide. I think visually it's important is that when we look at the difference between non-PLA students, which is the left-hand bar there, and this is the percent of adult learners completing a credential. We look at all PLA students as the middle one, and you can see there is a significant differential there at 22% higher completion rates. And then if you look at the far right bar, the difference there is that this group, they had excluded those with military credits, only because military students are harder to track and get the full picture of their completion rates, because of the nature of the fact that they have to move around. They're in and out of different institutions. And so looking at their completion rates are a little harder to get So when they pulled and controlled for the military credit, you can see it really jumped significantly. The gray bars there is with community colleges. So with this audience, that's an important one. The other is with the bachelor's. And not, I think what's important here is not to say, oh, it's, more important in the bachelor's area. That's not at all what the message should be. What it is in the community college level, we're also often, well, there's a couple different factors, but one of the factors is that there are a lot of requirements. And so when you go into a course match setup, a lot of times those programs are so tight in terms and very little flexibility that students don't have as much room to apply those credits. And so that's one of the things we also have to really be thinking about is the ways in which students can apply the credits that they're doing. Then one thing that I hear a lot is, aren't we giving away credits and what's this going to do to our enrollment and all these kinds of things. But what they found is that on average, students who are engaging in some form of prior learning assessment gained an additional 17.6 additional credits earned compared to the non-PLA students. So what that means is they're sticking around, taking 17 plus more credits. So it's actually boosting an institution's enrollment and higher completion rates. So then they also looked at this data by race ethnicity. And what they found, and again, the left-hand one is the non-PLA students, the middle one is all PLA students, and then the right-hand one is the PLA students, but without the military. And so what they found is that the PLA completion rates were significantly more for students of color. And so this becomes really important, especially in their research. They were finding that for Hispanic students, particularly, that was where the highest rate of completion rates for those students who had PLA. And so we really start to say, okay, so, this is important because when we start to recognize people for what they know and can do, then we start to open up lots more opportunities. However, they also looked at take-up rates. And in this case, our Black population within this data set, which was just under a quarter of the entire set, had the lowest take-up rates. So so then there becomes this whole question about if students of color have a different rate of being able to use the PLA or the credit for prior learning, what's going on here? And this 3% there that I have circled is for the 2-year public. So when they
Nan,
started
really quick.
looking at the,
Nan,
yes,
really quick, sorry to interrupt. A question
Yep.
came up about the previous slide about the Asian American students numbers. It says what happened to the Asian students in the right-hand side of the panel? The next,
I think yes. So so if I remember the research correctly, that they didn't have enough population when they took out the non-military. So that had to do with the numbers that they had in the population. So when they did the race ethnicity for all PLA credit earning, they still had, you can see there was 263. And we're talking overall that we're talking huge numbers here. I was thinking like the overall population, I think it was like 80 some thousand students. And so our numbers dropped out. And so when they got over to the non-military, it dropped out. It just became insignificant in the numbers, for statistically insignificant, not insignificant for the people. So Becky Klein-Collins led this research out of Kale and had done the research with Witchy. And then she and Brainsberger and Lane looked into the data deeper and to look at it even more from an equity perspective. And they they came up with 4 possible factors that kind of lower that uptake. One has to do with costs. And the credit for prior learning, any fees that are attached to that individuals have to pay are not covered by financial aid. And so when you have student populations that are already in need of the financial aid in order to go to school, we're now asking them out of pocket to pay for the PLA. So some institutions are really trying to address this. And the kinds of practices that I've been seeing across our country are things like providing scholarships around PLA. Some schools have eliminated the fees for students who are either military or maybe they're part of an opportunity program, and really trying to think about ways of lowering costs for students. Um, I was part of a study that Kale had done where we were looking at the business side of the PLA. And we found not very many, but a couple institutions that actually offer the credit for prior learning for free. And because it's in their mission and the costs they feel are important to just say, no, this is going to be open for everybody. The next one that they really address is the whole outreach, marketing, and support. The that communication of what is possible and how that outreach is conducted and how we think about advising. So they clumped advising under the support. I think it almost needs to be its own. But it gets back to Francis's comment at the beginning in terms of looking at this from a deficit perspective instead of really in terms of thinking about what somebody knows and can do. I apologize. I've got some noise in the background. It will only be another second. So it's really important to be thinking about what is that messaging, and then who, when the advisors are talking to students, when the recruiters, admissions, academic advisors, when any of them are talking to students, what is the messaging? What is sort of the implicit biases that have come in that sort of say, oh, well, that student's not been in school, they probably don't know anything, versus, wow, they've been working, they probably know more about something than, we find that some of our students know more than the faculty know about a topic because they've been so focused on their work. So it becomes really important in thinking about that messaging. The next one, in terms of thinking about institutional policies and practices, really thinking about the ways in which those policies and practices exclude some students. So for example, I know of one institution that has policy that in order to do a portfolio process, that the students had to have completed English composition with a C or above. Well, that means anyone who hasn't done English composition yet is excluded. And if it's a writing heavy process, then anyone who, as soon as they approach having to write out a whole lot of information, may have a lot of knowledge, but writing might not be the skill yet. And so you're saying, well, you don't have the skill unless you can write. Or the knowledge unless you can write. So some institutions are trying to balance that. I know of one institution that is allowing students to record their conversation. They do an interview up front, record it, and then they get a transcript of that recording and they can work off the recording. So literally our policies and our practices. Another thing on policy that I see are where some departments allow it and some don't. Well, if a department doesn't allow it, that basically tells students, well, you don't have knowledge and skills if you're in this area, but you do if you have over in this area. Well, what if you want to change over? Or what if you start to get inequities built in based on who's allowed to participate and who is not. The last one that they bring up is the self-confidence of adult learners. A lot of adults, when they're coming back, have not had great experiences in education and think of themselves as somebody who's not going to be successful in this. And so they may not be it may not be in their minds that what they already know and can do is college worthy. And so really helping adults understand that their knowledge and skills are college worthy. And it, again, as I said before, it may not fit this program, but it's still valuable knowledge, and really recognizing them from a strength-based perspective. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but I do want to point out, these are, we have these recommendations that are coming from this work. But I'm just going to hit some highlights here. So the first one is prioritizing equity in the design, really thinking about those policies and practices and how it really is accepting all students and making sure that that everybody has equal access to the pursuit of credit for prior learning. The second one is thinking about how to develop financial supports for low-income students. Again, the finances continues to be a barrier. When we've interviewed students, when I've looked at research across, this is something that is brought up a lot in terms of how do we really support students financially? If this is to help them move along, then we need to be thinking about how do we have supports to help them move along. I have heard some institutions say, well, you know, they're not having to pay for the whole course, so of course they're going to be able to pay for the fee. I mean, that's at least what they can do. And that immediately sets the student up in a situation where they may not be able to, because again, it's not covered by financial aid. There's one exception of where it's covered by financial aid, and that is if it's designed as a requirement of an academic program and every single student needs to do that. So if it's actually designed into the program, every single student goes through, let's say, a portfolio process, then that fee can be covered by financial aid, but it has to be considered a cost of the program. The improvement of communication to students about CPL, really thinking about those access gaps, thinking about what the messaging is actually saying. Is it really encouraging people, or is it again creating a message that sort of says, well, only some people can go this way? And you know, if I know for myself, if I heard, well, you know, some people can't do this, then I'm going to probably say to myself, I'm probably one of those people who can't do it. So how do we really think about it? And positioning, like, where's the information, who has the information, how the student gets the information. One of the things that I do with institutions when I'm working with them is to map out the student life cycle for CPL and looking at all the communication spots along that and how students are actually accessing it, how it's consistent information. I have seen some institutions, one institution that I worked with, they had different, the admissions office and the registrar's office had one message, continuing ed had a different message, the academic departments had a different message, and they were completely different. And so students were so confused, they couldn't believe how confused all their messaging was. So you really have to be thinking about, what does this mean for the learner as the learner is going through all of this? The next is really thinking about how to embed the CPL systematically in advising and in the curriculum. Again, making sure that messaging is clear, making sure everybody is well trained, and that every student hears the message about the opportunity. Thinking about the data infrastructure and analysis, and you know, really getting a sense of, you know, how are your students doing, and you know, are the data showing that CPL is impacting in a positive way for success, and thinking about how to disaggregate it for equity analyses. But again, I'm going to put that warning in about really making sure that if you're saying it's either is or isn't impacting different equity groups, that we really start to think about what else is in that. Is it about the advising? Is it about access? Is it about the kinds of supports that people need? The learning, you know, your learning centers, are they up on CPL and being able to support the students? I have seen in writing labs where I've heard from writing tutors that they have no clue what this is about, and somebody comes with a CPL portfolio essay and they're like, I don't know what to do. So again, how does everybody get involved with that? Thinking about, and I've mentioned this about having different kinds of ways to look at CPL, and thinking about different kinds of sources that the learning can come from, and then also the different ways that it can be recognized and applied to an individual's educational experience. And then one of the things that in the again, both in terms of what Kale's looked at, what I've looked at, what other people have looked at, is that in many ways it gets really complex in terms about the ways in which the credits can be applied, how they get applied, and really thinking about one, how that can be very clear to everybody, transparent to everybody, and how it can be equitable. I literally have seen processes in institutions where one student might get credit for something, and another student with maybe the same learning doesn't get credit for that. And it has to do because with much more of, like a department or a department head or a faculty member making the decision, instead of thinking about how can this be, very transparent and the same across students, so that we're not getting differentials just based on who's involved in the assessment. So I have a series of key questions here. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them. The slides are going to be available to you. But really thinking about, again, your policy, how you're counting the credits, thinking about what is being recognized, what they have to go through, what are the steps that the learners have to go through, and how do you minimize barriers for all students as they're going through that? How does the how do we think about that equity piece in terms of access and award of credit, and thinking about how that is, as I keep saying, transparent but also discoverable. How does a student know about this? And how does your website portray this? And what kinds of information is on the website? Thinking about the cost. How you really do professional development around this. Who are all the people who touch your learners, and thinking about how the messaging is consistent across your institution, from the, the recruiters, marketing, even IT folks that are going to be supporting the kind of the background of that. If you're going to do portfolio, are there technologies that are involved? And if there are technologies involved, how do the IT people help it be transparent in terms of how both the learners and whoever's assessing the learning have the clear messaging and the ability to work with that. Thinking specifically around messaging that reaches the different diversity populations, and really thinking about how you have really given an open and having inclusion in all of your messaging, and thinking about the data. And I'm about to get a little more noise again, so I apologize. So bottom line here is that what's important here are to really understand your value propositions within your institution around this, because that's going to structure how you write the policies, how you enact the practices. And so these are 4 value propositions that are at the heart of this, is that, the learning matters, not the source of the learning. So what somebody knows and can do is what's critical here, not how they gained it. That prior learning can have value towards a credential, that it belongs as part of a credential, that all people have valuable prior learning, and that, really getting that, and I keep saying this, but understanding how different knowledge can fit into the whole academic experience, and then being able to really be clear about what pieces fit within which requirements for a degree versus other areas that can also be acknowledged. And really thinking that I have heard from different faculty over the years that they actually learn a lot from their students, because they may not be in the field and they actually learn more from the students about the field, and they're able to bring that into the classroom and actually share it with other students. And so really one of the values is that the diversity of knowledge enhances the institution, that the learners bring knowledge into the institution as well as gain knowledge from the institution. And that is a part kind of core. So these are 4 core values that are, I think, very important to be considering. So really what we are trying to say is that with our learners, we really want to, they're kind of asking, do you see what I see? Do you know what I know? Do you see me? This is really important, is that when we tell a student, you have knowledge, I agree that you have knowledge, and that knowledge is equivalent to other knowledge that you would have gained in the institution. And so we're going to recognize it. That is a hugely powerful statement to somebody. When somebody is told, I see that you have knowledge and I think it's valuable, that's a very different message than, you're missing this and you're missing that, and you have to meet this requirement. The bottom line is that the whole learning recognition, it's an academic process. It's something that has to be thought of as an academic process. It must have quality and integrity, and it must have equity built into it. And so I'm going to end on that note. I'm going to stop sharing and then see if people have some questions, comments, that kind of thing. So thank you.
We don't have any more questions in the chat, but people can feel free to type questions, or if you have mic access, go ahead and speak your question.
Hi, this is Jennifer Johnston from Highline College in Washington State. Do you have a reference for the Department of Education policy that you mentioned, that financial aid can be used for PLA if it's required for the whole program?
So it is what the financial aid rules, and you're going to need to talk to your financial aid director, and that person would have access to the federal laws. What you're able to do is cover under any program, any costs, any fees that are considered part of the program. And so I do know that there are institutions, including SUNY Empire State University, that have built in some of the PLA fees when it is considered part of the cost of the program. But that means that you have to be able to show that every single student will be using it. So it gets built into the process of the program, and that it is a cost across the board. So it's a way of using the fees, the policy on fees, and applying it to credit for prior learning.
We have one hand from LaJoyce Brooks.
Yes, hi. I'm from Kalamazoo Valley Community College, and we have a pretty robust prior learning program here. And we've had this program for many, many years. I've been a part of it as the director for the last 10 years. And one of the things that I've noticed is that we've never changed the fees that we have attached to our portfolios, our certifications, and different mediums in which we use for prior learning. So one of the things I've been thinking or considering is I've been assessing those fees, and I've been considering increasing, and you talked about lowering the cost, and I'm thinking portfolios, because it's been a very, very minimum fee for a long time, and our program is getting more robust. But I want to hear your opinion about differentiating the cost for certificates, for certifications, and then for portfolios. Should those be the same? Should they be different? And then if someone comes in with multiple credentials as certifications, one person with multiple certifications, should one fee be attached to the multiple, or should they be individual for certification? What are your thoughts?
Okay, so personally, I believe having the fee as low as possible, but I understand the realities of having certain costs associated with this. So Kale has had for decades and decades 10 standards for assessing learning. And my own work, we have expanded that and came up with standards for policy, and I'll explain how you're going to have access to that very soon. One of the things is that the costs that are associated with recognizing, validating, and credentialing any learning needs to be based on the cost that it takes to do that, not just sort of an arbitrary money kind of amount. When we're talking about the portfolio process is the most labor intensive. When we talk about looking at certifications, licenses, things like that, a lot of times there's some cost up front. A lot of times it's faculty time to evaluate that. And therefore, once that cost is set up and there is a crosswalk that's established, then there really shouldn't be a cost to the student. It's not about, it's about the kinds of things that you're doing with the with the assessment part of that. And one advantage of doing things like workplace learning, licenses, certifications, those kinds of things, even though there might be an upfront cost, you can then work with different industry partners and have a way to bring in enrollment. And so some of the work that I've done has really looked at, kind of like what's the cost benefit of this, not just the cost of doing it. The portfolio is the tricky one because, learners don't know how to put a portfolio together around this. It's new for them. It's a new assessment process. And so it's important to do a lot of advising and helping them through whether you have a course. And so if you have a course and you give credit for the course, then that's where your money comes in from it. Excuse me. And then, you've also got the assessment of it. So the question becomes, is it really essential to cover those costs? Is it really above and beyond? Is it something that can be written into faculty workload? There's a lot of factors to be thinking about in terms of the cost. And then is it something that really helps to recruit and retain students? And therefore the cost of recruiting a student and retaining the student in terms of, if they can't afford to do the portfolio and end up not continuing with you, is that cost of loss of a student worth the cost of what it takes to collect a fee on it? So I think what's really important here when we think about equity and inclusion around this is to really think about it from the learner perspective. What is going to help them move forward? And how can we start to rethink our approaches to a lot of this, including the cost, from the perspective of how can we support the learners to meet their goals? How can we get them supported to be able to have access to our institution, to be able to persist in their program and to complete that program? And all of those pieces is actually bringing money into the institution. So if the credit for prior learning is something that increases that for you, then why charge more? So you asked me what my opinion is, and that's my opinion. But that's based on a lot of research and also looking at a lot of practices.
That's a great perspective. Thank you so much for that.
Certainly. I realize our time, I think our time, we've just gotten to that one point. One thing that I do want to mention is, and some of you may be familiar with the last few years with the Lumina Foundation funded REACH program. If you're in one of the 6 states that was involved in that, we did a piece of the REACH work that was around the credit for prior learning. Part of that was to build a website that's going to have a lot of information around credit for prior learning. We're still probably about 2 months out from launching it, but I will make sure that when it's launched, that Achieving the Dream can get that information out to all of you. in there, there will be one section that's all on kind of the business aspect of all of this and thinking about the kinds of costs that to consider when you're going into this and also looking at your value statements in relationship to costs. So there'll be a lot more information about that. So if there are no more questions, because I don't see any hands up right now, let me thank you all for joining. And we will make sure that this PowerPoint gets to your hands. Relia, I also have updated a little bit for the last one that I sent, so I will resend this one out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.